Okay, now I'm a couple of chapters into the second part of G.K. Chesterton's The Outline of Sanity. And I'm going to hit the highlights again, some of the stuff that really stood out to me. First of all, that the free market is more of an ideal than a reality, and maybe it always has been. He says, as for the people who talk as if property and private enterprise were the principles now in operation, those people are so blind and deaf and dead to all the realities of their own daily existence that they can be dismissed from the debate. That might be a little strong because I think we'd be dismissing an awful lot of people, but I wanted to read this one passage that just like it. He describes the mentality of the average kind of neoliberal individual so well here. And again, remember, he's writing in the 20s. So he kind of goes through the life of this person, the day, okay? He says, the reader refolds the Daily Mail and rises from his intensely individualistic breakfast table, where he has just dispatched his bold and adventurous breakfast. The bacon cut in rashers from the wild boar, which but lately turned to bay in his back garden. The eggs perilously snatched from swaying nest and flapping bird at the top of those toppling trees which gave the house its appropriate name of Pinecrest. He puts on his curious and creative hat, built on some bold plan entirely made up out of his own curious and creative head. He walks outside his unique and unparalleled house, also built with his own well-won wealth, according to his own well-conceived architectural design, and seemingly by its very outline against the sky to express his own passionate personality. He strides down the street, making his own way over the hill and dale towards the place of his own chosen and favorite labor, the workshop of his imaginative craft. He lingers on the way, now to pluck a flower, now to compose a poem, for his time is his own. He is an individual and a free man, and not as these communists. He can work at his own craft when he will, and labor far into the night to make up for an idle morning. Such is the life of the clerk in a world of private enterprise and practical individualism, such the manner of his free passage from his home. He continues to stride lightly along until he sees afar off the picturesque and striking tower of that workshop in which he will, as with creative strokes of a god, and then ellipses. He sees it, I say, afar off. The expression is not wholly accidental, for that is exactly the defect in all that sort of journalistic philosophy of individualism and enterprise, that those things are at present even more remote and improbable than communal visions. So what he's done is he's described the mental space of the neoliberal individual who works for a wage or for a salary, who has been more or less sold a variety of products, including his house, but, starting with his breakfast. And in his mind, everything is an expression of his unique and special self. And in his mind, he tells himself that he has the ultimate freedom to come and go as he pleases and to work when he wants. But the truth is that if he didn't go to his job on a regular basis, of course, he wouldn't be employed there, and that many of the things that he's enjoying throughout his day are not actually of his own work, nor do they express any uniqueness or individuality on his part. And many of things, in particularly his home, he doesn't actually own. And this is something that Chesterton just hammers away at, is that, a wage worker, or even I would say a salary worker, oftentimes doesn't own hardly anything. And so Chesterton wants to make a big deal over that. And I think that's a point well worth making a big deal over. He says capitalism has done all that socialism threatened to do. The clerk has exactly the sort of passive functions and permissive pleasures that he would have in the most monstrous model village. They are exactly the tastes and virtues that he would have as a tenant and a servant of the state. But from the moment he wakes up to the moment he goes asleep again, his life is run in grooves made for him by other people. and often other people he will never know. He lives in a house that he does not own. We call it ownership when we have a mortgage, but we need to remember that's not ownership. And actually, even if you own your house, at least in the United States, if you then later on don't have enough cash and fall short on your taxes, your house can be confiscated from you. So do you ever really own it? So he says he lives in a house that he does not own, that he did not make, that he does not want. Now that's a curious thing to say, which may mean that the house is actually a burden when it comes right down to it. A burden because it's a debt burden and he has to keep it up and so on. But it's what his society tells him the goal is, So he says he thinks in terms of wages. That is, he has forgotten the real meaning of wealth. Okay. Now, he doesn't state specifically anywhere in this, in adjacent to this paragraph, exactly what he means by the real meaning of wealth. But from reading more of this book, it seems to me that what he means is the means of independence. Okay. Like to the extent that you control enough property, enough means to be able to sustain yourself and your family, independent from hoping that you continue to get a wage based on your employer's whim or the whims of the churning economy. You have wealth, even if it doesn't mean that your lifestyle is as opulent as it might be with a lot of borrowed things and, maximal work for maximal wage, right? If you have not only property, but relationships that can provide you actual security, so you can say to yourself, like next week, if I don't have money, I can still feed myself. I can still shelter myself. I can still get help from others. This is what I think Chesterton probably means by wealth. Way less anxiety about the future. He says his highest ambition is concerned with getting this or that subordinate post in a business that is already a bureaucracy. So, his point is whether you're in state socialism and you work for the state, or whether you're in capitalism and you work for a corporation, you're working for a bureaucracy, you're working for a lot of faceless people, and you're working for a maintenance fee. And it's a maintenance fee that's like precarious because it's reliant upon that business continuing to do well or the state being solvent and so on. And so this is not ideal. Okay. So he starts to sketch out what distributism would look like. Yes, and this is my cat who's like partly something else, like a lemur maybe. So, obviously distributism to him means disallowing monopoly as like maybe even the first move, okay? And obviously also we've talked about this, it means private property for all, but here he wants to say, relax, we're not talking about a system that, evenly distributes all property in some very uniform fashion. People create these straw men that they can then knock down, and they say, distributists want to, basically give everybody exactly the same amount of property and to have no market at all. And apparently that's not true for Chesterton. It does not require all property to be equal, but everyone owns enough to have an independent stake. Everyone should be guaranteed enough to be able to feel that independence, right? To be able to feel that they could take care of themselves if they needed to. Also, he makes the point that this type of distributism will allow those so inclined to live and work communally. He says, hey, remember, the monasteries are basically communes. A certain number of people want to live that way. We don't want a society where everybody's forced to live that way. That's closer to the type of communism that he doesn't want. But he looks kindly upon this type of communal living. And so rather than discouraging it and thinking of it as something subversive, this is something that should be protected within a distributist situation. Also, he says distributism may make some resources or land in common, that making some things in common does not go against his principles of distributism. There are some things, maybe, certainly like parks and refuges and things like that, maybe some utilities, some things that everybody needs need to be basically made common. Okay, he doesn't spell out, he doesn't create a whole list of these things, but he kind of harks back to the idea of the commons in feudal times as providing people a common means of, another means that is common of supporting themselves. Okay, we still do some of that. We provide parks, we allow people to fish and hunt and things like this. Okay, so that's what he's talking about, stuff like that. He says also distributism does not exclude modern technology. What it would exclude is using modern technology to basically create monopolies, to create big technology that then disallows other innovations and other, businesses from sprouting up. Technology is a two-edged sword, and it can be used to destroy, as we know, and it often is. It more often does that than not at this point. So he says this to remind people again, hey, he's not a Luddite. He's not asking for people to go back to horse and buggy here. Technology is not our enemy. It all depends on how we use it. And then he also says, interestingly, distributism takes many forms. There have been many people with different ideas about how to implement it, and he's kind of open to all of them. So this is on page 96 and 97. He says, I myself know 4 or 5 schemes that have been drawn up, more or less drastically, for the diffusion of capital. The most cautious from a capitalist standpoint is the gradual extension of profit sharing. A more stringently democratic form of the same thing is the management of every business, if it cannot be a small business, by a guild or group clubbing their contributions and dividing their results. That's kind of like Mondragon, the Mondragon Corporation. Some distributists like the idea of the workman having shares only where he has work. They think that he would be more independent if his little capital were invested elsewhere, but they all agree that he ought to have the capital to invest. Others continue to call themselves distributists because they would give every citizen a dividend out of a much larger national system of production. I deliberately draw out my general principles so as to cover as many possible of these alternative business schemes. Okay? But basically he's not going to talk equally about all of them, but he's acknowledging here that there are a lot of ideas, and as long as the idea comes back around to providing people with the capital or property that they can control enough of that to allow them more autonomy and independence, then it's fallen into that zone where he would consider it. He gives, at a certain point, 6 steps towards distributism, which is really helpful for making the idea more concrete. He suggests, for instance, that we tax contracts to discourage the sale of small property to big business. So in the United States, we have, the exact opposite of this, basically. Municipalities encourage big business. They encourage chain stores to come in. In my own town, eminent domain was used to basically for the city to force small businesses out of a certain area of town and to allow big box stores to come in the name of economic development. And I'm sure that those big box stores were also given lots of tax abatements and things like this. So all of those small business owners, they didn't all get back into business. This was a real blow, and basically Chesterton is saying we ought to do the opposite of that. Okay. Also, he recommends that we abolish primogeniture. Well, we already have, right? For the most part, that is abolished. But back in his day, in some countries, it was actually mandated by law that your property had to pass to the eldest son only, not to the siblings equally. And you can see how that would continually concentrate property and wealth. Okay. He also says we ought to provide free legal aid for the poor to defend their small properties so that they aren't easily preyed upon by real estate developers and businesses that want to gobble up land and property. He calls for state protections for experiments in small property use by tariffs if necessary. So if people get an idea for how to singly or collectively use their property to provide something new and different in their area, the state could legitimately say, we're going to foster that, we're going to protect it, we're going to make the competition, say, from other parts of the country or other parts of the world a little bit more expensive. He calls on subsidies for starting experiments like this, that the state ought to even, provide a certain amount of funds and support for people to do things that are different. Like, for instance, I could see, subsidies for local farmers. If we say that more people ought to get into farming because it helps them be more independent and it helps their local area to become more independent, why not, support that independence with more state funds? And finally, he says a league of voluntary dedication would be nice. Now, I had to think about, what is that? What is, so I had to look up, what did people mean by dedication? And what he's talking about there is, the voluntary taking of maybe you're somebody who has more private property than you need. Maybe you are a member of the wealthy. Maybe when you die or maybe before, instead of giving all of that to your heir, you voluntarily give some to the public, either for commons or for redistribution. So that was interesting. Okay, the final interesting thing that I discovered here was a sort of veiled, I wouldn't say it's a veiled threat. It's like a veiled warning from Chesterton. Basically, he says, if we do nothing, capitalism is going to create conditions that are bad enough that we're risking revolution, that we're risking, state socialism, because that might be the only choice that people have. Okay, so here's where he says that. He says, but the first fact to realize is precisely that it is a choice between its breaking up, capitalism's breaking up, and its breaking down. It is a choice between its being voluntarily resolved into its real component parts, each taking back its own, and it's merely collapsing on our heads in a crash. And boy, was that prophetic, because the crash was coming, right? It's merely collapsing on our heads in a crash or confusion of all its component parts, which some call communism and some call chaos. The former is the one thing all sensible people should try to procure: redistribution of property, a more even distribution. The latter, a crash followed by some sort of communism of a state kind, is the one thing that all sensible people should try to prevent.